Imagine you're in the subway of Washington, D.C. Okay, I can see some of those confused looks. You're probably saying, but I've never been to Washington, D.C., let alone its subway. Okay, fair point. But I bet all of you have been to a subway in a big city, or you've seen plenty of pictures of subways in movies and TV shows. So picture a subway. It's a cold winter's morning in Washington, D.C. You're literally shivering as you're walking down the stairs deep into the city. In the background, you can hear the hum of the trains and the tracks, the doors opening and closing, the hum of the conversation of the commuters. You come around the corner, and you see a man playing a violin. He's wearing a baseball cap, t-shirt, blue jeans. He's got his violin case open in front of him with some small change in it. You momentarily pause to listen, but if you're like most of the commuters that day, you continue on your way. But if someone asked you later in the day if you'd heard the violinist, you would have said yes. But did you really hear him? Because on that day in 2007, that violinist was a part of a social experiment conducted by the Washington Post, a major US newspaper. That violinist was none other than Joshua Bell, probably today's most celebrated violinist. He plays on a 300-year-old Stradivarius worth $3 to $4 million. He was playing pieces that a few nights before at a nearby concert hall had commanded about $1,000 a minute. But during those 40 minutes, he'd collected a sum total of $32.17. So why didn't anyone hear this virtuoso performance? Because we don't hear with our ears. We listen with our ears. We hear with all of our senses. What's happening is that our senses are constantly collecting information, feeding it into our mind, our mental operating system, enabling us to make sense of the world by taking that new data and connecting it to what's already in our minds. But almost all the time, it's happening beneath our level of awareness. Think about how many times you've run into someone in a place you're not used to seeing them, and you cannot remember their name. Someone loosely connected with work, you run into them in the grocery store. You're working so hard trying to remember their name, you actually feel like you can see your mind working there, trying, searching for a match. That's exactly what's happening. It is a Google-like search of memory, trying to match that face, that voice, that person standing in front of you. And all too often, as we painfully know, we don't get the match fast enough. We've moved on to the grocery aisle, the next aisle. We're trying to figure out what to have for dinner. And Steve, his name was Steve. Your conscious mind had long left that mental challenge, but your unconscious processor, working beneath your level of awareness, was continuing to work to try to solve that problem. And that's what's happening all the time. We're getting millions and millions of bits of data in, and our unconscious processor is handling it all, working in the background of our mental operating system, enabling us to be able to navigate through the world. A perfect example is driving a car. We couldn't possibly consciously attend to every aspect of driving, which is why you can think back to the past 5 minutes and say, I don't even remember how I got here. No, your conscious mind can't remember it, but fortunately, your non-conscious processor had it completely under control, taking in the data, drawing conclusions of what to expect next. And that's exactly what happened in the subway. Whether you were consciously aware of it or not, all these messages were coming into you from the sights, the sounds, the smells, drawing conclusions, relating to past situations that might be similar, and telling you what to expect. Just another subway performer. Nice background music as I go off to work. And that's exactly what you heard. Now, because we hear with all of our senses, it's really important to understand that not all senses are created equal. We are a visually dominant species. Our sense of sight is our strongest sense. It's the one we rely on. It's the one we have the most confidence in. It's the one that if there's ever a conflict between what we hear and what we see, what we smell and what we see, we will defer to our sense of sight. In 2001, at the University of Bordeaux, 54 wine masters were given various wines to taste. Now, for those of you who know about wine, the words that are used to describe a white wine are very different than the words that are used to describe a red wine. So just by listening to the description of someone talking about a wine, you can tell, are they talking about a white wine or a red wine? Now, these 54 wine masters, experts in their field, were given a white wine that had been colored red. Every single one of them described it as a red wine. Their eyes saw red and told them it was a red wine. Their sense of sight overwhelmed their sense of taste and their sense of smell. Everything you saw in that subway, whether you were consciously aware of it or not, told you, not that interesting, and you continued on your way. Fortunately for me, hopefully everything you're seeing here is suggesting I do have something interesting to say. Thank you, Ted. But your conscious mind may be wondering, why is she standing up here? Well, that story begins many, many years ago when I was a director of strategy for the Coca Cola company. I was working with Gerald Zaltman, one of the world's leading sociologies in the area of consumer research. He was presenting a new methodology for us, and while explaining why this was going to be so effective, he was giving us a basic education on how the mind works and how we process information. But with every fact that he uncovered, I was going into my memory of the past 15 years of experience and saying, then why do we advertise like that? Why do we do packaging like that? Why do we do PR like that? So by the end of this presentation, I'm racing up to see Jerry. I said, Jerry, I have got to know more. So he recommended a book, Searching for Memory by Daniel Schachter. I got the book, I devoured it. I had Post-it notes on all the pages, I'd written on all the margins, long legal pad of questions. I got on the phone with Jerry, I said, Jerry, do you have time for some questions? There was an audible gasp at the other end of the line. And he said, you mean you read that book? I guess I didn't impress him so well on first meeting. However, Jerry answered every single question of mine very patiently, and to this day, he continues to very patiently answer every one of my questions. That book, that telephone call, launched me on a long journey of discovery, now well over a decade long, with hundreds of books, meetings with other scientists, academic papers and journals, all with two questions in mind. One, of all of this that I'm learning, what of it is truly relevant and valuable to marketers or communicators? And two, once I've got that figured out, can I make it simple enough? Can I make it sufficiently enticing to marketers and communicators? And we are all communicators. No, we're not all going to be standing up here on a stage with hundreds of faces staring back at us, fortunately for you. However, I bet all of you have something you felt so passionately about that you truly want it to be heard. Maybe it's a school meeting. Maybe it's a work meeting. Maybe it's a board meeting. Maybe it's the dinner party conversation. And I know you want to be heard, but don't you really want to be remembered? Because isn't that the true test of an idea's worth? If it gets shared, well, it can only be repeated if it's remembered. So think back to the last time that you felt so strongly about something that you spent some time crafting your message. Maybe it was a new direction for your business. Maybe it was strong opposition to a planned investment at your child's school. If you were successful in truly being heard by your audience, your idea was being processed in their working memory, which is where it has to start. But if it's going to be remembered, it's got to get from working memory to long-term memory. And the good news is, it's easier than you might think to modify your message to increase the likelihood that it's going to be remembered. The first factor that influences its movement into long-term memory is elaboration. We all know this word. You've heard it before. Let me elaborate on that point. Let me build on that point. Well, this is no different. This time we're just talking about let me build on the points in memory. My favorite story about this comes from when my son was 3 years old. A friend of mine drove up to the house in a convertible. Now, Charlie had never seen a convertible before, and he was completely confused. I didn't know it at the time. Anyway, he turned to me looking for some explanation. I didn't know what's going on, so I didn't say anything. He turned back to the convertible, and he stared at it a little bit longer and studied it. He turned to me with the biggest smile on his face, and he said, "Look, Mommy, a car with no hat." Charlie could only make sense of that unfamiliar item by connecting it to something familiar in his memory. It's a bit of a mental game of connect the dots. When I talked to you about the subway, I wanted to give you familiar references so your mental search wouldn't be too difficult. I wanted to find those points of elaboration very quickly. And this is in great contrast to jargon. You know, it seems to fly in front of you. Well, it's coming at you, but there's nothing that it can connect to. So it's literally going in one ear and out the other. The second factor is activation. How many senses can you activate? Because the more senses you can activate, the more neurons you get firing, the greater the likelihood the idea will go into long-term memory. When I talked about the subway, I talked about how cold it was. I wanted you to feel it. I talked about the sounds. I wanted you to hear it. I wanted to activate as many senses as possible through just a verbal story. And that is the third point, storytelling. Now, this is probably the one that sounds the most familiar to you, because intuitively we know it's much easier to remember a story than it is facts and figures. Well, long before the written word, our ancestors were using stories to carry critical information. It's not surprising. It's the glue of our memory. But stories don't have to be long and complicated. Think of the red wine. Think of the convertible. The next factor is importance. If I can't make my story relevant and valuable to you, there's about this much chance you're going to remember it. It's why I spent some time suggesting situations where you might want to be heard, where you might want to be remembered. The fifth factor is emotional. Now, this doesn't mean, does it make you cry? But it does mean it has to make you feel something. Does it make you sad? Does it make you angry? Does it surprise you? One of those powerful emotions in terms of its contagious qualities is surprise. It's why jokes are so memorable. It's why you'll remember the car with no hat long after this event. The final factor is repetitive. The more we repeat something, the greater the likelihood we'll remember it. We know this. We learned it in primary school with our math tables. Somewhere along the way, I think we seem to have forgotten it. However, keep telling your core content. Feel free to wrap it up and package it differently as many times as you want, but keep telling the core content. You've now heard so much about the master violinist who no one really heard that you will remember it long after this event. At its simplest, each of these factors is about maximizing the mental activation in the minds of your audience. The more firing neurons you get in their mental operating system, the greater the likelihood the idea will go from short-term or working memory to long-term memory. And even just remembering a few of these and applying a few of these will get your idea moving in the right direction. See? Easier than you thought. We all have ideas that we want to share. And the first step is about getting into working memory, which isn't quite as easy as just talking or playing on a very valuable violin. But the second step is about being remembered, getting your idea out of working memory and getting it into long-term memory, because that's where it has to land. If there's any chance, it's going to be shared by anyone other than you. In closing, I hope you have been able to hear what I've had to share. And I hope you'll be able to remember, because it is easier than you think. Thank you.